Hey everyone, welcome to the Writers Room podcast, and thanks for joining us on the epic adventure we call writing. We're your hosts,
Austin Matthews.
and Bob Dotto, and Holly couldn't make it today. And today we're going to be talking about short horror fiction with Kay Hanifen. Welcome, Kay.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. My name, as Robert has said, is Kay Hanifen, and so I've been writing basically all my life. But professionally since about 2021. I got my first short story acceptance in 2020, right after I graduated college, which was kind of awesome. And I have been writing and getting published mostly short horror fiction, but also science fiction and fantasy. And basically any genre that I can find find an open call for, I will try to.
Nice.
My goal is to get out there as much as possible.
Right
And
on.
yeah, so that
Nice.
is kind of me. If you know, so yeah, that's mostly me.
Okay. And then where can we find you? Where can we find your work? Where can we find you as an author?
So right now the best two places to find me are khanifenauthor.wordpress.com. That's where I keep all of my publication list, plus where I will sometimes post my thoughts on movies that I've watched and stuff like that. I do need to update the list, but you know how that is.
Yes.
Catherine Hanifen on Instagram, spelled KATHARINEHANIFEN. That's Catherine Hanifen on Instagram. I also am on Facebook with K Hanifen Author, and Twitter with the Unicorn Comic one, because the Unicorn Comic one was already taken, and I don't really. It was based on a blog that I had when I was a teenager that I would rather not mention beyond this point. Yeah, that is where you can find me, though, like I said, I'm not really on Twitter as much anymore after, well, everything, Twitter, or sorry, X.
Right.
And I'm not really on Facebook either as much. I mean, I will occasionally hop on there, but I'm not as big on Facebook either.
Yeah, I'm bad at social media in general. It's just, it doesn't interest me, and it takes so much time and effort. I know I need to be, but
That's the really hard thing about being a writer in the modern age, especially if you are a writer who is indie like we are.
Yeah.
It's that we also have to be our own marketers, and that means we have to be good at social media. And like sometimes you just want to write, you don't really care
Nope.
about that as
Nope, we
much, but you
don't.
have to, also learn how to win friends and influence people. And it could be the difference if you want to get published in a mainstream publication.
Yeah.
It could be the difference between getting accepted or rejected, regardless of the skill that you have with your manuscript, which is kind of frustrating, that we have to be our own marketing teams.
Yeah.
It also allows for freedom, but it gets weird, especially since that was like my Instagram is also my personal Instagram too. So like that can get a little bit weird sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
With,
I have gone and separated my two out so that it's not my
Yeah.
personal one anymore. Because like, I don't know that I want random people looking at my kids
Yeah.
and things like that.
That is true. I mean, my kids are cats at this point, so it's not that big a deal.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's it does get a little bit weird at points, because now all my followers are on my primary one, and I'm like, maybe I should get a Finsta at some point. But,
Some boundaries.
yeah, it creates some boundaries,
Social media boundaries. There's a topic we can get into sometime. Not
Oh,
tonight.
yeah.
Not tonight.
Not tonight.
No, we're gonna talk
Another
about
time.
yeah, another time. But so short horror fiction. How did you get into that?
So it's kind of started in high school, where that was a genre I didn't initially expect that I would enjoy writing. I lean more science fiction and fantasy. But I've always been like fascinated by scary stories, even if I was like, a lot of people I've noticed, and this isn't just like this is like with the horror genre in general, like people who are not into it as much. Sometimes I think it's more that they're more scared of being scared than they are of the actual stories. Um, in my experience, like that is kind of what happened to me, where I was more worried about, being kept up at night, and then I would go and watch something and I'm like, oh, it's not that bad. Yeah, like
Mhm.
I heard the first Saw movie is terrifying, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the most terrifying movie ever made, and I'll watch it and be like, yeah, I guess that was scary.
Well, see, like that's the thing, is that I feel like a lot of people are like looking for jump scares and don't want those kind of things that keep them up at night. But I'm the opposite. Like I don't care
Yeah.
about jump scares. I'm like, I don't want to be startled. Like I want something that sticks with me and haunts me. Like those are the
Mm.
things
Yeah.
that I'm going for.
I get startled really easily. I have a quick startle reflex. So being startled by something doesn't equal being scared in my
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
It's like a cheap shot, really.
it can be like, and sometimes, jump scares can absolutely be effective if they are done well and there's like an actual threat. It's,
Right.
about the tension and the release of tension. Much like
Mhm.
comedy, it's
Yeah,
sort of the tension, building of a tension and then a punchline. But
it is.
instead of laughing, you scream.
That's a good way to put it.
Or
Mhm.
flinch. That's actually mostly how I view structuring horror in a lot of
Mm.
ways, especially short form horror.
Mm.
Is it being actually sort of set up like a joke in a lot of
Mm.
ways.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Where you have the setup of, you know, something's happening, you're creating this tension, getting people invested, and then that punchline winds up being a punch to the gut
Yeah.
instead of making you laugh.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I was
uh,
watching an interview with Jordan Peele, and he was talking about the only difference
Mm.
between comedy and horror to him is the soundtrack. And I was like, that's a
Mm.
really interesting take.
Mm.
that makes a lot of sense. Like,
Wow.
I agree.
Yeah.
Jordan Peele's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, but
in
yeah,
both of those genres.
Right.
yeah, like you've seen a lot of horror that like I've seen horror movies like recut, like on YouTube they'll do like horror movies recut as comedies, or
Yeah.
comedy movies recut as horror
Yeah.
Yeah.
films and stuff.
Mrs. Doubtfire.
Exactly.
That's a
Yes,
that's
that's
a
kind
real
of a
That's
famous
a really
one.
terrifying
famous
one.
one.
That's a real famous one. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So those kinds of stories, it definitely works. I actually have a little bit of a controversial take that like horror and comedy are more tones than they are genres.
Oh, okay.
Because you can't really find anything that is straight horror or straight comedy. It's something plus the comedy or something plus the horror.
Right.
Science fiction plus horror.
Yeah.
Romance plus comedy.
Right.
Um, so to me, horror and comedy are so very similar in that they're also more tones than they are like
Hmm.
actual genres, I
Right.
guess. And
Hmm. Well, and
So,
go ahead, Bob.
well, I was going to ask. I just attended a StokerCon here in San Diego a while back, and I learned there's all kinds of sub horror genres.
Mhm.
Splatterpunk is something I've never even heard of,
Ooh, I
but
haven't
they
either,
told
but
me
that
all.
sounds fun.
Yeah, they told me all about it and stuff. So what? So okay, what do you? I mean, we're talking about horror. So what? Can you tell us like what you write? Like, is it like we're just talking about the? I mean, you're telling us about the structure, but is it you like hunting or you like splatter,
um,
gore? There's all kinds of different horror. So.
I think that, well, part of the fun thing of writing short horror fiction, like short horror, is
Hmm.
that and I do dabble in long form horror too. I just haven't gotten anything published yet.
Hmm.
Is that with short horror fiction, you can play around with all kinds of genres. So I've written gothic ghost stories, I've written
Oh,
splatter stories,
okay. Okay.
gross, gooey horror stories, and I've written or slashers, I've written a couple of those. I've written sci-fi horror, fantasy horror. Basically it's fun playing around with genres and stuff,
Right.
Hmm.
and like playing around with mixing and matching genres, especially
Hmm.
with horror.
Yeah.
So I like playing the field. I like doing all of them.
Okay.
I do less splatter, though I've done some. It's not my not the first genre that I go to. I think I lean a little more gothic in a lot of
Mhm.
ways.
Mhm.
I just really like gothic aesthetics too. Like,
Yeah.
it's pretty. It's
Very,
pretty, so I like
right.
it. Yeah.
Now, have you been to any of those places? Like, have you been like maybe Scotland or some big old empty building, empty
Actually,
church, castle, or
yes. Actually, I did live in a haunted castle for 3 months.
what?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so I went to Emerson College and it has a study abroad program in the Netherlands
Mhm.
where you can go and it's basically just gen ed courses and it's a lottery instead of like applying to instead of
Mhm.
applying for a specific program. And for a semester, you go to stay in this 13th century, it was like 13th century castle
Wow.
in like the rural Netherlands. And supposedly the castle had a ghost named Sophia. I didn't actually see anything, but I did have some friends who went on a ghost hunt and hung out in like the main common area of the main castle. Um and had heard like some creepy whispering and stuff and like heard someone like they were sitting the way that the room was structured was it had bunk beds
Mhm.
and with a desk underneath, and one of my friends was working in a desk like underneath the desk and heard like the bed creaking above her, like
Hmm.
someone had gone and laid down in the bed and then
Yeah.
like sat up and stuff. Um,
Yikes.
can't remember if she like looked up and saw a an impression in the thing or not, or she was just too freaked out to look up. Which would be understandable. And like the only thing that happened to me was that my fully charged laptop died randomly at one point,
Hmm.
and like the battery just completely drained. And the only
Right.
other time that had happened to me was when I was walking through the Tower of London a few
Yeah.
years earlier and stuff.
Yeah.
So that was weird.
Yeah.
But that's about it. I didn't, and there was one area that had like weird vibes. I don't know
Mhm.
how to explain it aside from the fact that it was just too quiet.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, over where it was like the computer room that they had. It was kind of over by the farmhouse. You would climb up. It was usually weren't very many people there because people would just go in to print stuff off, like plane tickets and stuff, because we were expected to travel on the weekends.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so I don't know, there's something very unsettling about that area where I don't normally like play music on my phone out loud when I'm like in public and stuff because that's rude.
Mm.
But if I was alone up there like to print something off, I would like turn on my phone and start playing music or
Mm.
something just to like break the silence because I was
Yeah.
Mm.
so unsettled by it.
Creeped out.
Yeah. Also I should mention that I lived in a tower on the forecastle, which was like the protective area
Mhm.
originally.
Mhm.
So like when we first went there, um when they were first guiding us to our rooms and stuff, our group was like the last group, so they would take us up and down all through the forecastle, showing people their rooms, and then they get to our room at the very end of the line,
Uh-huh.
and you open the door and there's this terrifying dark staircase.
Oh.
I'm
This
like
is great.
yeah, you can't like, obviously you can't see me right now, like get an idea of my height, but
Yeah.
I'm 6 feet tall, pretty broad shouldered. This thing was teeny
Oh
tiny.
yeah, all their staircases are super narrow and
Yeah,
ridiculous.
Mhm.
it's super narrow, super small, super dark, and like ducking and like
Yeah.
it was like something out of a nightmare. The
Right.
room itself was really nice. Like once
Uh,
you get up there, it was like nice and spacious and everything.
Mhm.
But yeah, the staircase up there was pretty creepy.
oh
Uh
gosh.
when my friends would visit, sometimes I'd have to escort them to their rooms because they were so creeped out by the staircase.
That's
And but
funny.
like the problem is too that like it was only like one person could walk down up and down at a time
Mm,
too.
yeah.
So that could run into issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
So that was my time in a haunted castle.
wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's cool to just take all those like weird random experiences in life and just draw from them. But too, it's like,
Yeah.
you're talking about like having that silence and like breaking it, but like also like sitting in that. I mean, like what could happen is just such a joy and like hard to do in the moment, but also it's like, oh man, like it could be
In
anything
retrospect,
happening.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, in retrospect, I'm surprised. I've like tried to write stories based on my experience with staying at the castle, but nothing really has come
Hmm.
yet. I don't know. Sometimes you know how it is. Sometimes you have a story
Yeah.
idea that you want to write about someday, but every time you try to put pen to paper,
Hmm.
it's not ready to come out yet.
Hmm.
That's sort of how I feel about my experience in the
Mhm.
castle, even though it's been coming on like 5 years now.
And
Mhm.
Yeah.
how? What do you take away from that? Like, so you want to write a story, but you don't. But there's definitely elements, right, that you experienced that you can add into other stories.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like I mean, if I wanted to write a story set in a 14th century castle, I also would be able to tell you the general layout of how the castle works and stuff from that memory, and that helps. It's one of those really cool experiences that helps, and the idea of studying abroad and being isolated in another country. It was not my first time being alone some distance away. My college was an out-of-state school, about a 12-hour drive from home. So, but it was my first time being alone in another country,
Mhm.
and stuff. So that kind of isolation and can be very intimidating too. Especially like when you're like staying in an old place and stuff. The what if factor
Hmm.
is always fun. It's always fun to play around with.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun until you cross a line, and then it's like, oh, this is not fun anymore. Let's stop this.
Yeah, yeah. Once it gets truly creepy, like, oh, that could have ended very poorly for me if
Mhm.
not for certain factors.
Right. Yeah.
Um, yeah, if you have some kind of near miss, that's always terrifying.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's kind of why I like to move into more of like the speculative horror. Like slashers
Mhm.
are not really my thing because, like, well, that could happen all the time. Like, plus I write a lot of fantasy, so like the thing that like doing with demons and those kind of like monsters are like my jam for horror. But like taking some of those same things and really just adding them into any genre of like, okay, here's how you increase tension in a scene, and using that
Mhm.
same skill to like, even tension in a romantic comedy, like you
Exactly.
still need tension, and so that's going to be drawing from
Mhm.
those same elements as horror.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. It
Mm.
helps having some working with a variety of genres helps you and stuff with
Hmm.
creating it. I know exactly what you mean because I work as a ghostwriter for romance novels. So, which is very much not in my wheelhouse, but it's the opposite of my wheelhouse, really. As like an asexual woman who's attracted to other women, it's like writing heterosexual romances is kind of the opposite, but it's also a great way to like, stretch the boundaries of what I'm comfortable with too.
Hmm.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
writing a lot of contemporary stuff that doesn't really have any supernatural elements to it, and um, writing
Yeah.
heterosexual character dynamics, which I don't do very often.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
But it helps you grow, stretch as an
yeah,
author too, because you have to explore
Hmm.
those things that we're not familiar with, but we need to get the
exactly.
story out. So I think that's pretty.
Yeah,
You're really lucky to have something like that. Honestly.
it is. Yeah, it is a pretty good job, and I am pretty lucky to be able to have it and the ability to like write write for it and
Hmm.
stuff, and be able to like have a job with writing is
Yeah.
very lucky.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
even like I make jokes about it because the plots are not in my wheelhouse. Um, it is a job that I am very lucky to have, and I acknowledge that.
Hmm.
It is still very nice to be able to make a consistent paycheck writing.
Yeah,
Mm.
and
Um,
and I definitely get that it's not in your wheelhouse because like this closest thing I have to like a romance novel is a sci-fi thriller where it's just two characters, and it's the one human character and the computer, and they kind of have like a romantic will they won't they through the whole thing.
I like that because that's always interesting to me. I like weird romances. Stuff.
Yeah.
I'm currently reading The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ
Mhm.
Klune, and that's a very cute romance in my opinion. That's the kind of romance that I normally enjoy. On the off chance that I pick up a romance story.
Mhm.
But also it's got a lot of fantasy elements to it because it's basically about a child. If you don't know the story, it's about basically a social worker for supernatural beings coming to an orphanage for them and assessing whether or not the orphanage is a safe place for them to grow up and stuff. And then along the way he falls in love with the quirky headmaster of the orphanage, and it's a very cute story. It's very sweet and funny.
Yeah.
So definitely recommend it. My non-horror recommendation.
Yeah. So short horror fiction, what does that look like? Is that what's the word count on that?
It depends. I usually say under 10,000 would be considered short horror fiction.
Okay.
Like novelettes, you start getting into novelettes and novellas the further up you go, but
Yeah.
primarily under 10,000. That's really like what most anthologies that take short horror fiction do. So generally and then from there, under 10,000, it also depends on the kind of story you want to tell as well. Some stories require more complexities. They need those 10,000 words.
Right.
Other stories you can get by with 1,000 or 3,000 or something.
Flash fiction or something.
Yeah, flash fiction.
Okay.
Flash fiction is great for short horror. Really, you can pack a punch pretty easily.
Yeah.
In just lines.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, say 10,000, you're working on something. I mean, you really have to wrap it up real quick. So why don't we talk about like some elements that you do need in there and then elements that we don't need in there? What would be like a few elements that you do need in a short horror fiction?
For anyone with the short horror fiction, the first place I start is with characters. And a little bit like setting plot. I usually have I call it an outline, but it's really like a miniature summary that's maybe like a couple sentences or something getting started with the basic premise of whatever I'm writing. Like the general direction that I want the plot to go to. And then I have and then I start writing the characters with it, with this kind of plot idea in mind. Often it's based on something that like I see an open call for an anthology, so the anthology, the character and everything is based off of that anthology call.
Okay.
And then there's sort of this, so I sort of go with the character. I try to think actually before the character, there's a different step that's just as important, and even before the plot summary, is the angle that I want to take with it. Because that to me is actually even a little more important than character and plot, is because horror, as much as I love the genre, and I do really love it, it can fall into harmful cliches. The scary mentally ill person is probably the biggest one that you can think of. Like the mentally ill person is a dangerous schizophrenic with multiple personality disorder. It's actually dissociative identity, but that's not what they call it, because people who are ignorant of that disorder, that's not what they call it. So like, and those kinds of horror stereotypes are leaning into the grotesque, like physical deformities that people cannot control, inherently making someone monstrous.
Okay.
Those kinds of things, I try to think that through before I get started on a plot. If I'm given like a premise, only a premise, I try to think it through in terms of like, what is something that a lot of people see and how can I turn it on its head? Like the mentally ill person is the protagonist of the story, for example.
Mhm.
I have one that I came out with like about a year ago that I was really proud of, called House Rules, and it's about a woman with OCD. It's sort of a gothic story about her coping with the death of her wife in a in a house where she's haunted by what happened and has essentially become an agoraphobe.
Mm.
And the
Mm.
ghost in the story is the spirit of her wife, but she is not malicious. The wife kind of the woman blames herself for what had happened, but the goal of the ghost in the story is to help her begin to live again after this tragedy has befallen her, and she's retreated so much into herself that she's created these rules to avoid the potentially confronting this ghost,
Mm.
um like covering all the mirrors in the house and checking and rechecking the locks every night and keeping the bedroom door locked, and all of these rules that she makes up for herself to keep the ghost away, because she's afraid that the ghost blames her for what happened,
Mm.
when that's not the case. Her goal is to get the woman to live again. That's a sort of flipping it on its head that I like to do.
Yeah.
Um
So the angle does the angle have to do, and it might be both, but the angle have to do with your protagonist or the monster itself?
Both.
Both, yeah. Okay.
It depends. It really depends on the story. Another one that I did, was called Devil Child, and I'm blanking on the name of the anthology. Um, but I'll look up the name of the anthology in a minute. But it's a story told from the point of view of a Jersey Devil inspired monster.
Mm.
And it's like the character herself is not monstrous, but she is treated as such by everyone around her. And there's a tension that comes from, the torches and pitchforks in the villages and all of that.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find the name of the name.
Yeah, because I think there's definitely something to the whole, like, I mean, even thinking about
Dark
classics like
Matter
Frankenstein.
magazine.
What was it? Dark
Dark Matter
Matter?
magazine is what it
Mm.
was.
Okay.
But even thinking about like Frankenstein, like a classic of the horror genre, and like really there's the horror of like, oh hey, there's this monster. But like if you read the book as opposed to watch the movies, like the horror is the monster as the protagonist
Mm-hmm.
and like how everybody treats him. And like
Yeah.
that's where the real source of the horror is, and what is humanity, and like this existential horror of all of this. And like
Yeah.
I think it's cooler to go for those deeper things as well.
Yeah.
Same.
Well, in
Knowledge
the yeah.
knowing that knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein is not the monster. Wisdom is knowing that Frankenstein is the real monster.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was gonna say the doctor is sometimes seen as the
Mhm.
monster for actually. Why would you do that? Why would you
Yeah.
create this?
He's not even a doctor. He doesn't have a doctorate. He didn't even
He's
graduate
a
from
medical
college.
student.
He's a medical student. He's not even a doctor.
He
Honestly,
had what, 1 year of training?
yeah. I'd really love like a horror comedy version of it,
Oh,
because
that's young
build
Frankenstein.
the body in a giant, like, he didn't build the body in this isolated gothic castle
Right.
with an Igor sidekick. He
Yeah.
built it in his college apartments.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But I would really love to see a story from the point of view of the
Right.
people who live with the Frankenstein in the other buildings. Like, oh,
Right.
there goes Victor. Yeah, he's a bit weird. The room smells like rotting flesh, but he pays rent on
But he's
time and
nice
keeps
enough.
himself.
Yeah.
We don't really have any noise complaints, so it's whatever.
That would be funny. That's a great premise.
Yeah.
All right, so we got characters and angle, and then you just have at it.
Exactly, and often I'm definitely a pantser, so sometimes I don't really have much beyond that, and then I find the story when writing it.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, kind of like what you said though. Like, what was the name of the magazine?
Dark
Dark
Matter?
Matter magazine.
Dark Matter, and then they say, hey, and I've seen those too, where they go, hey, this month or whatever it's going to be about the dead, or I don't know, something like that. And so that's what the theme is, right? So you just kind of shape your story into what they're asking for. Yeah.
Based on the theme, and then like what intrigues me about the theme. That's sort of what I do, and what maybe I struggle with sometimes when I am trying to write. Like I've always struggled a little bit with werewolf fiction for some reason. I've never been a big werewolf person in general, so it's like, even though it has things that, I would find interesting to explore, I've just never really gotten into it as much for some reason. Not saying that I won't ever do it, just that it's or zombies. A lot of stuff with zombies is overplayed. So
we're done with
once I write a
zombies.
story about the question
Hey,
of
don't
what
say
if
we're done
zombies.
with zombies. I've got zombies in my story.
Oh yeah, okay. Besides yours, okay. Besides
So, but
yours.
mine are a little weird. So they're actually a hive mind ruled by a single person, and so
Oh,
that
that's
makes it.
actually kind of a cool concept too.
Yeah, and then they end up killing that one person, and so it's about how do you go from this community, like, and it's basically dealing with the struggle of like losing this community of like, hey, we were all of like one mind and one like will. What do we do now? Like,
That's a
and
really
so
cool concept.
yeah, so they're the protagonists. So
that's a really cool concept. I like that a lot. But yeah, the anthology Open Calls does help a lot. And it's sort of what really made me fall into the genre too, is that I found this website called the Horror Tree that aggregates open calls for like primarily horror fiction, but they will also do science fiction, fantasy, and all of that. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it the Horror Tree at this point, but it's still an amazing resource for writers of genre fiction, especially horror writers, but also you'll find a lot of science fiction and fantasy calls in there as well. Another one that's pretty good is the Sinister Scoop. That one's fairly new, so it's not as established and with doesn't quite have the same variety as the Horror Tree, but it's also very new and very helpful a lot of the time in finding places for your work and finding inspiration too.
Yeah. No, thank you. I was going to ask about that, and I'll include those in our links down below. If it'd be in YouTube or listening on Spotify. So that'll help. Thank you. So we talked about what you kind of need and all the ingredients to get going. What are some things you're going to have to leave out in a short horror fiction?
Resolution sometimes. Like I said, if it's often with short horror fiction compared to longer horror fiction. With longer horror fiction, you have a little more room for characters to breathe and stuff. But short horror fiction, you want to get to the point a lot faster. And then you want to end on that punchline, like in a joke. I don't know if you've ever seen Hannah Gadsby's Nanette, but she was talking a lot. She was a stand-up comedian, but this was not as much a comedy special as it is like sort of a discussion. And she talked about how she was like the difference between a joke and like a story is the structure. A joke has the setup and punchline structure, while a full story has what comes after the punchline. And so she was talking about it in the context of being a lesbian woman who's gender nonconforming, and how she told a joke several times in stand-up routines in the past about how she was kind of chatting up this one woman, and then the boyfriend shows up and he's starting to get aggressive and angry, and he's like, oh, wait a second, you're a woman. Sorry, I didn't wait, I didn't realize you were a woman. And then she's usually ends the joke there. And then she was talking about how later on, but then what came after was that he had like attacked her and stuff. And so that the horror novels and longer horror fiction goes beyond like what was the initial punchline that we're talking
like you almost Yeah, you almost explain the punchline, I suppose, or something.
Yeah, you explain the punchline and then you go beyond it and explore the implications of it. While short form horror fiction just ends at the punchline.
Hmm.
Like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. That's a great
Yep.
setup and punchline there. Setup and like
Yeah.
stopping point of, you know, this is what happens when in this small town,
Right.
in order
Yeah.
to get the crops to grow. I mean, I'm
Right.
sure we've all read The Lottery at some point,
Yeah.
in our
School.
schooling.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very different than the like structurally compared to say The Haunting of Hill House, where
Mhm.
you go into this psychological descent into madness.
Yeah.
You have less space and less room for that kind of descent,
Mm.
so you have to start it at the point where they're going mad
Mhm.
and then
Mhm.
see what happens from there.
Yeah. Wow. That's it's exciting, I think. It sounds very challenging, but it sounds very fun, right? Because
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
because you almost don't have to mess around with the superfluous stuff of character development, character arc. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I feel like you have to be a lot more lean with it, but
Yeah,
you would
really
still have to
lean.
have it, but you got to be super lean. It's like how quickly can you make us fall in love with with the character, the setting, or make us invested to where we would actually be scared or care what happens.
Exactly.
Like getting that connection in such a short time.
Mhm.
Like my go-to example of doing that is the first animated Spider-Man movie, where he's like singing the song and doesn't know the lyrics, and she's like, I instantly love this character, like instantly in love with Miles, because like that's me. Like I don't know.
Very
Like,
endearing, yeah.
Hmm.
It's trying to find humanity in the monstrous, I think, is a part of it and stuff. Whether the monstrous is your protagonist or your antagonist, understanding like why they act the way they act, I think is a part of what makes it what makes it effective and what builds these connections. Also, if you picking a human emotion to focus in on and zero in on, along with fear, I think is another one. Like fear and anger, or fear and grief. Grief is a really popular one in horror, because it's something that we're all going to have to experience at some point in our life. And sort of like how I said the only thing worse than fear is the fear of it. Even if even if you don't know, like haven't lost anyone really close to you, you still have that fear of knowing inevitably that you will. And so that, I think, is why horror and grief often go hand in hand just as much as horror and comedy, because there's that it's exploring mortality, but it's not just your mortality that you have to deal with in life, but the mortality of everyone around you that you love.
But it's also oddly like a safe place to explore it. And so it's
Exactly.
like it gets kind of a bad rap, but it's like this is a place where we can come and like prepare ourselves or work through something that's already happened. And so it really is a really cool thing that we can give to people.
Yeah, that's also why I love it too. It's cathartic in a way. You're like in the Greek tragedy sense of the term too, is that it's cathartic in that you experience these emotions in a safe setting so that you're better prepared for when you have to experience it in real life. And like in a way that also becomes comforting, and it also can be very empowering too. I'm fascinated by women in horror. Did you know the horror genre, like horror films, is the only genre in Hollywood that has gender parity? Where female protagonists actually outnumber male protagonists. And partly it's the paternalistic, they must be protected at all costs kind of thing. Like there's an increase in fear because women are seen as more vulnerable.
Right.
but it also becomes something that is more empowering too, because
Hmm.
yes, women are more vulnerable, seen it by society and by the horror
Right.
genre as more vulnerable.
Right.
They're also the ones kicking ass.
Yes.
And there's also a
Um,
reason we have the final girl as a trope.
exactly.
It's they're going to live.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're
One of
going
them
to
is.
live. They're going to kick ass. They're going
Yeah.
to be Ripley or Laurie Strode or
Hmm.
Nancy, whose last name I'm forgetting from Nightmare on Elm Street.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's neat.
So
Yeah. That's very interesting.
it's a very like explore. I think gender exploration and like genre horror is just such an interesting funhouse mirror to
It
society in
is.
general,
Yeah.
Hmm.
and what makes us anxious, what makes us tick. And I think that's part of the reason why it's become so popular in the past couple of years too,
Hmm.
is because it is so, um, well, we live in very anxious times.
Yes.
We can say that.
Yeah.
We'll say
That's
that.
absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
So because we live in anxious times, I found like I really started getting like obsessively into horror during the 2020 pandemic.
Mm.
My
Makes
sister
sense.
asked to watch a movie with me, like a scary movie with me, like because I was just downstairs and she's like, "Hey, you want to watch this with me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." I think it was maybe one of the Creep movies or something. And it kind of flipped a switch in my brain, and suddenly that was like all I really wanted to watch was horror.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um,
Because that's
because
what
it
you
was
were
something,
feeling, I guess, maybe.
yeah, it's something that you're
Yeah.
feeling, but it's experiencing it in a safe environment and getting
Hmm.
that, catharsis of, okay, well, if Nancy can beat Freddy Krueger, then I
Yeah.
can survive COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like putting on a sad song when you feel sad. Like, it's just nice
Exactly.
to have something to put like words or pictures to what you're
Hmm.
feeling or that anxiety that you have or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it validates, yeah, it validates your feelings, but I also feel like you can play in that sandbox in a safe way.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
I don't know if we have. I've never gotten COVID. I still can't believe it. But
Hmm.
I don't want it. I mean, we've seen the
Hmm.
respirators, we've seen, what people are going through,
Hmm.
and you don't want it, but you can use these feelings of fear
Hmm.
through
Yeah.
reading or watching a movie and just kind of, what I'm saying, like kind of
Hmm.
dealing with it in your head, like how would I react or
Hmm.
whatever in
Exactly.
a
Yeah,
safe
you're
way.
going through that negative visualization of like, okay, I feel like my life's pretty bad right now, but how bad could it be? And
Exactly. The,
you-
yeah, having OCD, I definitely relate to that. You can play the worst case scenario, best case scenario, middle case
Mhm.
scenario, which is
Yeah,
probably where it's gonna fall anyway.
yeah.
Yeah.
My
Um,
ceiling fan's wobbling a little bit. What are the chances it's gonna fall on me and decapitate me in the middle of my sleep? Probably not very high, but do I think about it? Yes, I do.
yeah,
Gosh, that's
exactly.
awesome. Okay. How about what are some things that scare you that you and do you write about them? Like you're writing gothic, your ghost stories, but are you
Hmm.
really afraid of ghosts? Is that something you absolutely do not want, or is it you're indifferent towards it, and so you can write about it safely?
So I think that's a good question. Am I scared of ghosts? Maybe is an easy way to start. Maybe. Let's
You have yet
Yeah, that's
to.
an easy
less than
question. Maybe.
scared of ghosts, more like scared of the unknown,
Yeah, right.
Because ghosts most of the time they were just people too, maybe people who are stuck, at the worst moment of their lives or moment of their death, which
Mhm.
would be the worst moment of their life potentially.
Mhm.
So, and that's sort of where compassion for the monsters comes in, where I don't know if I'm necessarily scared of that. Demons, on the other hand, yeah. Scare me. So I've worked like through exposure stuff, having OCD. Demonic possession for a time was like an OCD theme.
Mm,
So were zombies a little bit, but not like I'm literally going to become a zombie, but more of
mhm,
a um I was using it sort of as a metaphor for like my disease related anxiety. And I think the thing is that it's less the monsters that scare me, and more the stuff underneath the monsters, the underlying anxieties. Like zombie apocalypse stories unsettle me more than most. They make my brain itchy is sort of the way I describe it, because like I said, I have OCD, and a lot of it is very disease related. And one of the big themes that I have for OCD is rabies. And both the zombie virus and rabies represent something subconsciously in my head, a lack of control over myself.
That's
And that lack of control leading to me to harm others, to become mindless and no longer be myself. And the fear of demonic possession also comes from that fear of the lack of control. And so when I do write stuff that is, you know, like genuinely unsettling to me, that's sort of where I would draw from when I'm drawing from fear. Another one that grief I mentioned being a fear, the fear of grief, experiencing that through your horror is a great avenue for that, because like mortality, grief is something that is an inevitable part of life. Another big horror theme that I have is loneliness. That feeling of disconnect from others, and maybe even from yourself sometimes, where that kind of isolation can be its own special kind of pain and stuff. You know, being a nerdy kid in high school, you and you can probably relate to that. Or like, you know, being someone who is somewhere neurodivergent, like me being OCD, me being queer, that also leads to that can lead to feelings of loneliness and stuff. People not quite understanding, you know, who you are, what you and like the feeling that you have to like face these horrors on your own and stuff. Or even some stories I've written some stories where people take solace in the horrors because it's better than the loneliness they're feeling.
So it's almost like a lack of acceptance too. I'm just trying to think of my own fears. Yeah, loneliness, lack of acceptance. Just stuff to draw on from our own emotional experiences, or wounds, so that we can kind of fuel what we write if we're writing short horror or horror in general.
Yeah, horror in general. Short horror is a great way to like get to the point with it. And like explore these emotions when they're taken to their extreme. While longer form horror is a great way to slowly build to that kind of those kinds of emotions and stuff. And I think that's what makes great horror, is drawing on these feelings that people have.
Relatable,
relatable feelings, this negative sense they have and stuff, maybe about themselves, about the world. It all builds to something. And then horror acts as the funhouse mirror, exploring, you know, why you might feel that way, and also what can happen if your fear is taken to its logical extreme.
Yeah. And like that's the thing too, is that like one of my stories is a magical horror school. And so part of it is like doing this like categorization of fears. And so what I did was I looked at, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like each one of those represents a fear as well. The lack of those things is one of those hierarchies of fear. And I feel like for me, if I'm writing a short story, those lower things where it's like safety, food, those kind of denials are easier for short form. But once you get into like self-actualization, like, okay, that needs a little bit more to unpack.
That makes a lot of sense. Out of curiosity, have you listened to the Magnus Archives?
Oh, I love the Magnus Archives. They do such a good job. Even with those higher things, they're like, we're going to get it in there in 20 minutes.
Yeah, he definitely, like, once you listen to it, you can't stop. Everything becomes those kind of categories of fear, in a sense. He did such a great job with that series.
But in that same light, like I think each of the episodes tends to deal a lot with those lower, baser kind of
Mhm.
things, but then like the actual overarching story deals with those like, okay, what is existence? What am I? And do I have
Yeah, what is
control?
control? Yeah.
Hmm.
Do you have fate or free will? Yeah. Yeah, I've those kinds of primal fears versus the existential fears, I think,
Hmm.
is sort of what you're getting at. And both kinds of fears are really important to explore because you definitely viscerally feel like the primal ones of like food, shelter, safety are the visceral ones,
Hmm.
but the existential ones are the ones that haunt you.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
ones you're gonna have to yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I didn't even know how to explain that, so I'm done. So
Yeah.
Well, and I guess that brings us to don't section.
yeah,
I
time for
guess, yeah.
don'ts. Time for don'ts. We've had some time to think about don'ts.
Yeah. Don't.
I can start us off,
Austin is gonna start us
Okay.
off. Go ahead.
and I'm gonna say, don't be afraid to be vulnerable, because that is
Yes.
going to make it so much more build so much more connection to the reader, and it's really going to be, legitimate. It's going to feel real and visceral and all of that stuff, whether it's, what it's like to go through starvation. Like, I used to be anorexic, so being able to go through, like, hey, you can like feel your body start to like eat itself, like that feeling, that coolness, and it's actually feels really refreshing. Like, getting into those nitty gritty details are
Yeah.
going to make it be like, oh, this is chilling. Or like, my biggest fear is losing my kids. So like having a character go through that experience, like I feel like I can perfectly imagine a lot of what my reaction is going to be like. And so just getting vulnerable with it is really going to have people
Yeah.
respond.
I totally agree. I struggle more with like nonfiction and poetry for that reason, because that to me feels like it's getting more to the cutting more to the quick of it.
Mhm.
Horror to me is like the Perseus's mirror in facing Medusa. You can't face it directly with
Mhm.
horror or any fiction. You can't look at the monster directly. So you
Mhm.
use the mirror and the reflection in order to face your demon. I definitely agree with that. It's important. Hi, I am back.
Hi, Kay.
I do apologize.
Hey, no worries.
There's nothing like being in the middle of a horror discussion and suddenly being plunged into darkness.
That's
Oh,
fair.
really? Is your whole house?
It's back now. It was back on. It was only like
Oh my
a minute or
gosh,
two,
that's
but it was like
horrible.
the entire house just went completely dark.
That's horrible.
And suddenly the great old ones are there.
All the glowing eyes.
Yeah.
Mm-mm-mm.
I mean, I would usually just assume the glowing eyes are my cats. Two black cats is just living with a couple tiny voids. Yeah.
Glad to have you back. I'm glad glad you can jump in. Glad you
I'm
were not eaten by eldritch horrors.
I am glad it was not either. Plunged into darkness, but came out of it the right and survived.
Right.
Which is what horror is all about, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you come out alive, sometimes you
Yeah.
don't. It
Sometimes
depends
you
on the
come out
horror
alive,
writer.
sometimes
Yeah.
you don't. Sometimes you get eaten by the monster, but hey, your story was still worth telling.
Right. Right.
Oh,
That's good.
yeah.
All right. So my
So-
don't would be I would say don't limit yourself when you're writing. I know we talked
Yeah.
about word count being 10,000 or so. I would just
Yeah.
say just write it out. Maybe have a bigger story, and sometimes we can do that. I know your goal would be short, but if let's just say you're going to stick to this short, like no, I do want to get down to 10,000. I'm going to say
Mhm.
yeah, just keep going, 15, 20,000, and then pare it down to
Yeah.
the bare minimums. But don't you know what I'm saying? Like when you're writing your character, oh, I shouldn't do that because this has to stay within 10,000. No, just keep going,
Yeah.
edit it later,
Mhm.
and get it back down from there.
Yeah. I would caveat that though with try to shoot for the word count goal if you are writing for a particular publication.
That's fair.
Because while that would be true if you like maybe need fill the space for like writing a novel or something, or
Mhm.
potentially writing on your own time. If you're writing for a particular publication, try to keep it within the word count because there might be the publisher might set very firm limits on that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fair.
Definitely.
Yeah, the 10,000 words was just like a rough estimate of what.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Though I will say too that, like, Bob, to your point, is if you want to try having both and then see which one's better, because like I remember reading Ender's Game, the short story, and I was like, oh, I didn't like the novel, but goodness, it's a great short story.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's like, hey, this works better in one form as opposed to the other, and having those different versions of like, hey, how much can I actually stretch this out? Does it need it? Is it more useful?
Yeah. I've done that too, where I had like a short story, and I'm like, I actually think I would like to expand it into a novella and just to see where it goes. It's sitting in my my Google Docs waiting, not Google Docs, Microsoft Word waiting to be edited at some point. I may come back to it, but you know how it is. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm just letting it rest for a bit. Like
Yeah.
it's like bread, you have to let it rest.
Just let it rest.
And yeah, my don't. Let's see. I mean, aside from like, I guess don't fall into cliche or think through your, I think a better way to say it a better way to say it would be to think through your cliches when you use them. Don't be, here it is, don't be thoughtless when you're writing.
I like that. Yeah.
Don't be thoughtless.
Right.
Put thought into stuff because it's a genre that is very cathartic. And I do not fault the people who love it for like the blood and guts and stuff. I definitely do. I will watch a splatter or slasher movie that doesn't really have much of a plot just for the kills. I have no issue with that on like on an enjoyment level. But also if you are writing something, you still do have to think through it because, as I said earlier, writing horror often lends, because it reveals our underlying cultural anxieties. A lot of our anxiety is fear of the other.
Yeah.
People who look different, talk different,
Yeah.
are different from us.
Yeah.
And when you are writing a story that deals with this fear of the other, you kind of have to interrogate what about the other that you're actually scared of so that you don't reinforce real life negative stereotypes. We don't like I call it a Jaws effect story. Where you know how Jaws caused like an uptick in killing sharks and the acceptability of killing sharks because it was like it portrayed sharks as like mindless killing machines.
Right.
Another example would be Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. They might say, oh, he's not actually transgender, but it still plays into trans stereotypes that have become harmful to the trans community. Same with, say, Psycho, too, would be another example of that.
Yeah.
And so when you're setting out to write a horror story, you have to think through the implications. You can't be thoughtless about it. You have to think through sort of like comedy. Am I punching up or am I punching down? Going back to horror and comedy being the equivalent of the comedy tragedy mask. It's not the tragedy mask isn't crying, it's screaming. You have to think about whether or not you're punching up or punching down.
Yeah.
And because horror is a great way to speak truth to power. But at the same time, it can also be a great way to keep your put more weight on the necks of the marginalized. So yes, don't be thoughtless.
Nice.
Yeah. And I think that's honestly, like, unfortunately, really common in the horror genre. Like, I mean, even titans of the genre, like H.P. Lovecraft is, particularly of note. And it's just like,
H.P. Lovecraft is something else.
so it's like, I mean, the mythos is so interesting and stuff, and like, so it's like been picked up by so many other people, but him as a person,
yikes. Yeah, I always when I write Lovecraftian stuff, because I do enjoy like the Cthulhu mythos and like the idea of the outer gods, that kind of dark pantheon thing.
Mm-hmm.
I always write it in such a way that would have him rolling over in his grave. So
Yeah, I get it, because
the
the
protagonists are the heroic protagonists are queer, they're women, they're people of color.
There you go.
Anything that would make H.P. Lovecraft roll over in his grave,
No.
I would do that.
yeah, my protagonists are the Elder Tours, so
Well, that also works. That's also
glorifying
perfect.
the other.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean that would definitely make him roll over in his grave. The guy was
Yeah.
scared of
Mhm.
air conditioning. It really wouldn't
Yeah.
take much. Um,
I mean, hey, for somebody, I mean, that's part of it too. And like as much as he was, pretty
a big
hateful, yeah, like he was also very scared, and like that is a thing
Yeah.
too. And like,
that is an
and so,
interesting element too. Like his fear his hatred of the other definitely stemmed from fear. And I think a
Mhm.
lot of it is, like I said, a lot of horror is the fear of the other.
Right.
Dracula, for example, is one of my favorite novels. That one, Dracula is kind of the ultimate other.
Mhm.
Honestly, I like it more for like Mina and the character dynamics that are kind of underexplored in Hollywood.
Mhm.
But yeah, that kind of fear of the other is a part of what makes horror powerful, but it also needs to be
yeah,
tempered and explored.
yeah. And to your point, it needs to be thought through. Like,
Yeah, you need to think it
and that
through.
means as writers, we need to look through. And it's like, why are we afraid of the things that we're afraid of? And is it okay
Mhm.
to explain it or go through it the way that we are, or is that harmful to
Yeah.
people? So
Yeah, you don't want to, you want the blood and guts on the page. You don't want it to actually hurt anyone.
Yeah.
yeah, we want to scare people, not harm people.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you, Kay Hanifen.
You're
This
welcome.
was fantastic. You're bright, intelligent.
Thank you.
I know you write fantastic stuff. So where can we find you again?
So on Instagram, you can find me under Catherine Hanifen, KatharinHanifen. You can find me, my author website is khanifenauthor.wordpress.com. You can find me on Twitter at the Unicorn Comic one, like Unicorn Comic, but without the C and then a
Mhm.
one. And then you can find me on Facebook is either Catherine Hanifen if you want my personal one, or Kay Hanifen author for my author page. Though, like I said, Twitter, you're less likely to find me on Twitter and on Facebook
Yeah.
these days.
Yeah. Now, just for our listeners, K is not just the letter K; it's Kay Hanifen.
Kay.
Yeah.
Hanifen is Hanifen
Right.
because that one for some reason it's spelled like it's pronounced how it's spelled, but people don't really get that right.
No.
I don't know.
Why would they?
It's
Why not?
it's what it is.
Well, okay, we need to have you on again.
Oh, thank you.
Because yeah, we're a little early for our Halloween episode, but like you got
Yeah.
some great,
I'd
you
love
have
to.
great
Yeah, I'd love to be
insight.
back for Halloween.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
You've got some great insight, and it'd be fun to talk to.
Thank you.
So that's it. It was lovely having you. We will have you on again at some time in the future.
It was a pleasure
So
meeting you.
thank you very much. So don't forget to subscribe to our channels and at the links we'll supply. Kay mentioned the Horror Tree and the Sinister Scoop as
Yes.
resources for new writers or writers to dig through and to go look for channels, right?
Yes.
So we got those links. But yeah, so we don't want you to miss any of the Writers Room content. So dig into those links. All of our links will be there. We always love to hear from our listeners. So if you have a question or topic you want us to dive into, please get in touch. And until then, we will say arrivederci. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.